What's going on, y'all? I'm Parker.
Well,
Today we're going to be discussing the ego again. Last week we had a discussion about it, that and the self, and we weren't super content with our discussion, so we decided to reapproach the issue or the topic. And I'm just going to start us off with like a simple definition. So the ego defined by Google at least, or the Oxford Dictionary, is attachment and thoughts. Today we're going to focus on attachment. So attachment is pretty much just what you identify to be a component of your identity, right? So, for example, I consider myself to be someone who consistently goes to the gym or exercises. So, something that I attach to myself, my identity, my ego would be someone who goes to the gym. So, this attachment can have profound downstream effects. But for now, I would just like to ask you, Will, how does the ego show up in our day to day lives?
so I think you nailed it with the attachment part. And I think a large part of that attachment is like comparisons, um, because frankly, like there's almost no reason to. It's hard to support the ego without comparisons, um, whether it's supporting it in a good way or a bad way, um, like whether you're feeling negatively or positively, I more should say. But I think the way that those attachments affect our daily lives are by tying themselves specifically into our identity. It's like one thing to be attached to something. For instance, like if you're a mother or father and you're attached to your child, obviously that child is a part of your identity and like that can have a lot of benefits. But it's more attaching these like traits to your identity. It's kind of like you said, if I view myself as someone who's in very good shape, um, then whenever if I'm suffering from like an injury and I can't work out, then oftentimes that will breed insecurities. And in general, the attachments into your identity breed a lot of insecurities, which obviously go hand in hand with comparisons. Really, almost every negative emotion I think is directly tied into these attachments. And I think that those attachments often kind of cause these like stagnation periods, especially in terms of the emotional state that you're in. So a lot of the emotions that I would qualify as kind of these like stagnant emotions are things like insecurities, things like shame, discontentment. Almost anything that I can think of that's a negative emotion. Anger is often like a very outward expression of protecting that like version of self that you've built. Um, so like almost anything negative seems to stem from these attachments. But the way that I would say they impact your daily life, just to give an easy example that, obviously you threw out is like a sporting team. You have this vague attachment to this team that you have no realm of like being a part of or like having any actual say in what happens. Yet when you're watching it, like whenever I was watching the finals for the NBA, I was actively frustrated by the fact that the Mavericks were losing because I didn't want the Mavericks to lose because the Mavericks are like my team. And so, or like the Lakers, Lakers were bad this season. And so like I couldn't even really watch them because it just would make me frustrated. Uh it's such a silly one because obviously like everyone knows that that's stupid. You shouldn't have any like actual negative emotion tied to the fact that you're watching a sporting event, but that's just how attachment works in general. And so if you're going to reap those positive rewards of being attached to it and like being like, oh, like we're winning the championship, like, yay, then you also risk the fact that that attachment's going to cause you negativity. And so it's not necessarily, the way what we're talking about kind of what your relationship with these attachments and your ego should be. It's not that you should have no attachments. It's more just you need to be aware of the attachments you have and also be aware of how to disconnect and be more aware of how you're controlling those attachments. Which of those attachments are actually important to you, like the example of parents and their children. That's a very good attachment. It's something that reaps a lot of reward. It's a lot of satisfaction. You're raising this child to be a very good you know being, something that's very good at existing and very good at producing a not even producing, just being a part of like a positive society. And so that's a really good attachment. But your attachment to, I'm someone who likes to know a lot of things, and so if I don't know something, often that feels like like I've lost my label of like the intelligent guy. And so because I'm attached to that, whenever I don't know things, I often get this like flush of insecurity, and I try to defend it by making it seem like maybe I do know a little bit about it, or any of these things. And so it's just about controlling those attachments, and about at least just being aware of them. And so hopefully then you can start to disconnect from the ones that are causing you issues.
So,
So
what attachments are could cause good things, and what attachments can cause insecurities?
I think attachments to, now this is all going to be kind of general because it can happen both ways, but I think attachments to people are typically good things as long as you're being selective about the people that you're actually attaching yourself to. Like if you have a best friend, or your family, or whatever it may be, those attachments are positive because they are putting you in a community. And community is very important for humans. We're very social creatures. And so those attachments to me are good things. Whereas attachments to ideas, or attachments to a lot of things that are going to be tied to your identity in terms of character traits, those I typically would categorize as maybe like more negative attachments, because of the fact that you're feeding the ego. And like like I said, if I'm attached to this idea that I'm intelligent, or if I'm attached to this idea that I'm in really good shape, or if I'm attached to the idea that I treat people a certain way, whatever it may be, then whenever things don't go according to that story, that plan that I've made for myself, then I'm taking in a lot of negative emotion because of that attachment, rather than the attachment just benefiting me. And so again, even those character traits, you can be attached to them in the sense that like this is something that I would like to be, and so I'm going to put the effort in to strive to be that. But I'm not attached to the idea of it. Like I don't, you know, I can be an intelligent guy, but I am not necessarily like an intelligent guy. That's not something that's like innately part of my existence. And so whenever I disconnect it from my actual existence itself, from my identity, that's when I think I can reap the benefit from it, as just kind of having these things as these more like trait attachments, as more less attachment, and kind of just um, like a concept or a headspace that you're striving for,
Hmm.
rather than constantly feeling like I'm because if I view myself as intelligent, and then all of a sudden in a random situation I'm not intelligent, my view of myself is now being destroyed, and so I'm having to like compensate for that, which is usually where the insecurities and comparisons and all those things start to come out. And obviously a lot of this has to do with the story. I've mentioned it once already, but like the story that you tell about yourself and how that plays into your identity. So I guess my question for you would be, what exactly is the story that we're talking about that you tell about yourself? And, how does that story influence what you're doing? And like, just what does that look like in people's lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So the things that we choose to attach ourselves to determine the story that we tell ourselves, because that is pretty much what those things kind of go hand in hand, right? So if I tell myself that I am, if I attach myself to my ability to perform on the basketball court, um, so I'm, telling myself that I'm good at the sport, I can go out there and perform very well. That's a story I've told myself. I've told myself a story about my ability to succeed on the basketball court. However, you can tell yourself a number of different stories. In fact, you can tell yourself pretty much infinite stories about infinite scenarios. And those stories don't have to be physically related. They can be related to many other things, such as your ability to be consistent, your ability to influence a situation, or also just your quote unquote ability to control a circumstance. Um, and if the story you're telling yourself about the quote unquote control over your circumstance is pretty much kind of a delusion, all these stories aren't necessarily 100% true. I mean, some of them can play out because that's, maybe you told yourself that you're going to go out and go to the gym this day and move this amount of weight, and you do it that day, and it's the story you told yourself kind of going into the moment. However, that's a delusion because it hasn't happened yet, and because all you really have are those past experiences that you're kind of determining this story off of. But the story entirely dictates your ability to actually go out and do. This story dictates your reality, because what you tell yourself is going on is what's going on for you, right? So if I tell myself that I'm not capable of being good at basketball, I'm never going to be able to do it. Um, and a lot of this comes into agency. So if we're telling ourselves a story of, I'm not good at basketball, I no longer feel that I have agency to perform. And this can go to the most extreme ends for both, for the spectrum of of how much you deem yourself to have agency or not have agency. So for someone who would be on the opposite end of the spectrum, and they would say that they have extreme agency, so much so that they feel that they can kind of control every circumstance, then they can put themselves into toxic circumstances. For example, in a relationship, if, for example, one partner in the relationship deems or tells themselves the story that they are able to perfectly control and comprehend the setting at hand and approach it perfectly, and so therefore they're putting all of the result, all of the experience on them. So when, for example, there's miscommunication, it's entirely their fault because they're deeming that they control the entire circumstance, which obviously isn't the case. You're interacting with another human being, you don't control them. You really don't control much at all. You can only really influence things. And if you are saying that you have complete control over how this interaction will occur, and then it spirals out of control, then it's all your fault. Now it's also good for other things. If the circumstance went like slightly out of hand and you recognize things that you can improve on, that's great. If the circumstance went perfectly and you really were happy with, like, how you interacted, that's also great. There can be really many benefits from it, but I think in the end it ends up being a downfall because you have the conception, you live in a reality where you should be able to control pretty much everything, and that's obviously not the case. That's not how life works. There's an infinite number of things that we don't control. um, and so if having, too much ego, if entirely being determined, how do I say this? If you are entirely determined by that story, if that story is exactly how you live, then you're completely determined by your ego, because your ego is the thing making those attachments, which is then determining the story that you're telling, right? So if you're completely abiding by this story and choosing to have full or not at all agency, um, then you're completely abiding by that ego, abiding by that story, and never, changing it to adjust for experience, changing it to adjust for capability, changing to adjust for what's actually most productive for your existence. Um, so this kind of delusion of control is really just the stories that we're telling ourselves. And if we can change our perception on what these stories are and their relationship to ourselves, I think it can really benefit people to understand what they do and don't have control over, and how they can and cannot change things. Um, so to push this back to you, Will, knowing now that the ego, is this thing that just creates attachments, and those attachments can just dictate the stories that we're telling ourselves and therefore the reality that we're living in. What kind of stories, and what kind of attachments so should we kind of be utilizing to improve our lives? And what um, what is a reality that makes the most sense, where it's a good balance of the ego and not the ego? Because obviously, as we can see here, if we're entirely abiding by the ego, there's problems. But if you don't have an ego at all and you have no attachments whatsoever, well, you're not really there. There's nothing of substance, because it's just you're not attached to a single thing whatsoever. And now that's like kind of the ideal Zen way to exist, but that, or Buddhist way to exist, but that's just not, as applicable for the common man. So yeah, in a long-winded way, what is the proper balance between, telling yourself the story, and, you know, um, being real with yourself in reality, and what is the story that you really should be telling yourself?
Yeah, I think you kind of almost even said it there in the question. It's this idea of just being more in tune with what's actually going on, rather than kind of, I guess the best story to tell yourself is it's either one of two things. I think it's kind of the same thing the way that I mean it. It's like either it is the story that is true, or it is the story, or sorry, or it's not telling yourself a story at all. And it's just kind of accepting the moment by moment thing without necessarily forming these attachments. And so I think it kind of goes into what we were talking about last week. And I know we said we weren't going to talk about the self because it gets convoluted. But I think if we're going to define the self as kind of just this idea of awareness, just the fact that you are aware is what you are, then I think that is essentially kind of the thing that you're striving for. It's at least it's just to constantly be aware, especially of your attachments. That way, you can start to figure out which attachments are bringing negativity into your life, and start to prune those off. And so, just as examples, I we've been talking about the gym. I I enjoy being in good shape. I enjoy looking good, and so that, and I also enjoy being able to like move around well and be athletic. It brings a lot of positivity into my life, and so that attachment to this idea that I'm going to continue to work out, like that's something that I like to do. Um, that is something that I'm okay with, even though sometimes it's going to bring negativity into my life because sometimes I don't look good enough, or sometimes I'm not happy with the amount of weight or exercises that I'm doing, whatever it may be. I'm overall content with the fact that it brings positivity into my life. Whereas if I'm, dating someone and that person is, it's just not my person, there we have some things that we do differently, we think a little differently, we don't function very well together. Not even that they're a bad person or I'm a bad person, whatever it is, we just don't function super well together. And so that relationship causes me anxiety and stress, and feels overbearing or whatever it may be. Then I need to realize that that attachment to this person is something that's causing me more negativity than it is positivity. And so I think kind of the story that you're going for is just to be as aware as you can about the circumstances that you're in. Just be very present, be very conscious about the things that you're doing. And that way you can really use those emotions as an indicator of kind of the life path that you should be taking. For instance, if I notice that I'm experiencing a lot of negative emotions with this certain attachment, whether it be the attachment to this person, whether it be an attachment to this idea of self that I
Even the
am.
attachment to the gym that you had prior to.
Exactly. Then I have to be able to prune that and get rid of it. Not in the sense that it's just all bad, but it's that if it's causing me undue negativity, then it's just not something that's worth keeping around. The same way that I would say, we kind of had this conversation already, but like shame and insecurities being motivators, um, they can be motivators to achieve something, but they're not motivating you to achieve something for the benefit of achieving it. It's motivating you to benefit from, or it's motivating you to achieve something to overcome like something that you feel you're not good enough at. And so even those emotions, even though they feel like they can be kind of noble in the sense that they're allowing you to achieve some level of success, at the end of the day, they're still attachments to an idea, a delusion that is impacting your life in a negative way. And so it's just about being aware of these attachments. And I think the best way to do that is to kind of get a good grasp of like what your personal ego is doing, the way that it likes to behave. And so I think it's just about watching, we said the ego is attachment, and like kind of these comparisons, these assumptions. So I think it's important to just try to be as aware as you can whenever you're thinking comparatively. I think that's the easiest one to start with. It's, if I'm about to think something about myself and it's, I'm not, for instance, I'm not big enough. Okay, but what am I'm comparing myself to something, because to not be big enough means there has to be something that I'm thinking of that is either A, big enough, or bigger than me. And so, like, even just that simple of a thought, I need to catch that and just be aware of it and think, okay, but that's a comparison. And I'm not that guy, or I'm not that, whatever it is. Like, so I just need to focus on what I am. And so I can be, I can get bigger than myself. I think that's an okay comparative thinking. It's like, it's just because you're not comparing yourself to an other, you're just comparing yourself to you. And I think that's ultimately like, you just catch your comparisons, catch your assumptions, that's probably the hardest one. because it's hard to be aware that you're assuming something, because a lot of those assumptions go like really, really deep. But I think the best way to craft that story to have a healthy relationship with your ego is to essentially just be aware of what it's doing, and that way you can catch it and make sure that you're the one in control and not your ego. And so whenever I have these moments of negativity where I'm feeling shame due to a comparison, or whether I'm making an assumption that's causing me negativity rather than like fleshing it out, or if I have an attachment to a person or an idea that is causing me some form of negativity, I just need to be aware of that. And so then I can stop and look at it. Like even something as simple as words, we all have kind of these different meanings of words, at least to us, at least like emotional meanings. It's why, certain words are like quote unquote banned. You're just not allowed to use them because it makes certain people feel a certain way, even though like to me, some of those words don't actually have any real like meaning or any weight. And so even little things like that, it's just catching them. And so if somebody says something as simple as like, you mentioned my previous attachment to the gym. It's like if somebody had said something to me last year around the lines of like, "Oh man, you look really lean." One of my first thoughts would have been something along the lines of, "Oh, so I'm like, I don't look very big." Whereas in reality, that's not what they said. I just have attachments tied to those words, to that literal sentence. And so it's only me that is causing me distress. And so if I would have just listened to the words they said and heard, "Oh, you look really lean," and thought, okay, well, what they mean by that is that I look really lean, which is, that doesn't mean I can't also look big. And so it's just literally about catching those whenever you feel that negativity, or even the positive things that come from the ego. Just try to be aware of as much as you can be, so that you actually are the one deciding what attachments and what emotions not emotions you're allowing yourself to feel, but like what attachments are causing you emotions and which attachments you would like to keep around, I think is really what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, it definitely seems that it's not necessarily a matter of being attached or detached from the right things, but rather being aware of what it is that you are or are not attached to. So when the a moment arises where that attachment affects your reality, you are aware that it's affecting your reality. And then you can determine how you'd like to shift the attachment to make the reality either more realistic to what's actually going on, or better suited for your personal development. So if
Yeah.
approach the gym this time not with the idea of I'm going to get to this size or I'm going to get to this point, with rather that I'm just going to show up every day and I'm going to put in my work really well. I'm going to do the exercises that I have set in plan. I'm going to follow my plan really strictly, and that's how I'm going to go about it. Then you're now attached to following your plan, um, as opposed to getting to a certain size, because you don't control necessarily how your body results from the exercising that you do. Now, that's a very generalized statement. And what I particularly mean is that you can't 100% confirm that you will end up in the same place that you were before with. I want to make sure this is actually coming across the way I want it to.
You control what you do, you don't actually necessarily control what happens. Like,
Yes.
and I think that it can even be labeled into just success in general. Like, we can control that every week we're going to put this podcast out, and we can control the fact that every week we're going to try to get better at kind of laying out what we're talking about, get a better idea of it before we talk about it, so that our podcast come across cleaner and our viewpoints are portrayed more effectively. But we can't control if the people that watch it will enjoy it, and because of that, other people will watch it. We can't control any of that. We can just control what we do. And so you can do the things that lead you to the path of success without having an attachment to the idea of success.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the big problems that hyper successful people may run into in terms of the balance of success and happiness, or contentness, is that idea of constant striving, but they're striving for a particular goal. And the issue that may arise from that is that they'll get to that goal, but it wasn't satisfactory enough. It wasn't what they, ever dreamed of, and they don't really enjoy it that much. Like they enjoyed it when they initially got there for those few moments. So, like, they're really happy they got the CEO job, they got the promotion they were looking for. But now it's on to new and better things. And while that's great for promoting more success and striving to be the best you can in that specific niche field, it can limit you in regard to your perception of yourself and the reality that you're telling yourself. So maybe because that promotion wasn't good enough, you aren't either. But that's clearly not the case, because prior to getting the promotion, you thought the promotion would make you good enough. So I think one thing to recognize is that as an individual, you are good enough in every single moment. Does that mean that you can get better? Absolutely. And you should be striving to do that. But you're not going to cross a boundary that's going to put you into some, perfect way of existence, because there isn't a perfect reality. So the reality you tell yourself is the best one you can in that very moment.
Yeah, and I think this kind of plays into that idea that self-improvement is this funny thing because often, especially self-improvement content, um, revolves around, kind of this idea of like mental masturbation. It's like, okay, I'm going to, I'm going to watch all these podcasts and I'm going to journal and I'm going to meditate. I'm going to go to the gym 5 times a week and I'm going to increase my productivity. And then, like, once I have all of these things down, then I will give myself a break and I can be happy. When in reality, like, especially actually for like internal self improvement stuff, a lot of times it's about achieving these things. But what people like, it's the most simple thing. And we all got taught this when you're kids. You don't gain happiness, like genuine happiness, from achievement. You gain genuine happiness just comes from you. And so if you are not experiencing happiness, there's only one thing that you can do, or sorry, there's only one thing that can affect that change, and it's you. It's not some achievement, it's not somebody else. Now, all of these things can have impacts. Like, for instance, if I, if just to throw the same examples in again, like if I'm going to start going to the gym again and I'm going to start just trying to go consistently and like work really hard, then whenever I notice the fact in 6 to 7 months that I'm bigger and I look good and I'm stronger, then I can be like, oh, like this is awesome. I got to reap some of the benefits from my hard work. But the reason that I'm reaping those benefits is not because, like, I'm not happy because I'm bigger. I'm happy because I'm happy with myself for putting in work. Um, and so it all kind of goes back into this loop that, you are the person that controls essentially you. This is general, but like you control your reality. You control the world that you live in. And you might not be able to control everything in it. I don't get to control what you do, and I don't get to control what, Lulu or Huckleberry does. Um, Especially Lulu, actually.
Hmm.
But I do get to control the way that I feel about those things, and I do get to control what the things that I'm feeling that are negative are from those. And so, even self improvement is funny because so much of self improvement, especially nowadays, now part of this might be the little echo chamber that I'm in. A lot of self improvement like revolves around, internal self improvement. It's like, okay, it's not that I'm trying to get better in terms of achieving things. Like, I'm trying to get better in terms of like the way that I view the world and a lot of these, topics. And it's funny because even that often is this like egoic desire, and you're feeding into all of the things that your ego is trying to protect. So, for a long time, I was scared of, being an angry person. And so I actively avoided anger in almost every circumstances by like constantly pursuing happiness. And so um, I was feeding this by constantly avoiding it. I was feeding this idea that like I can't be angry. I can't be angry. When in reality, 100%, like there's times where I'm going to be angry. And so if I avoid that, if I like, or not if I avoid it, because you can still like you can avoid it, but like if I'm scared of that and I'm actively trying to force everything to stop, like to not be that ever, then I'm never going to be like, I'm not going to be comfortable with feeling my own emotions. And I'm not going to be comfortable with dealing with things that might make me angry, which then lead to me probably being angry. And so, like, it's kind of this, the things that you avoid are the things that you end up creating type idea. And it's, if I'm really afraid of being seen as less intelligent, then all the times where I feel less intelligent than other people are the things that I notice the most. And so I'm creating that for myself rather than like, I think I'm a pretty smart guy, but obviously like there's tons of people out there that are smarter than me. And there's tons of people out there who know more than I do about a lot of different things. And so that's just a part of the game, the same way that I know certain things that they don't. And so I kind of just dragging it back to the initial like attachment thing. We've talked about the fact you just need to be aware of those attachments so that you have control over what attachments you're making. But also, it feels like one of the best way to maintain control over those attachments is to try to have the most quote unquote like real view of reality, which to me is the baseline concept that all I am is a guy. Like I'm just a random dude who happens to exist, and I have a lot of circumstances and a lot of experiences and a lot of attachments that have made me the way that I am. But because of that, there's nothing inherent about me. And so I can be anything, but because I have the potential to be anything, that also means that I am nothing. And so having that view, I think, really gives you a good sense of being able to approach things in a way that means you can control your attachments better. And it's funny, we're even talking about this with control rather than realizing there's also going to be attachments no matter what that you can't particularly do anything about, even though you can be aware of them. And so it's just about really, really hammering down the concept of focusing on the awareness. So, it's just, I am not a smart person. I am not a person who's in good shape. I am just a random guy who happens to have some of those qualities, but those also are not the things that define me. In fact, there is literally nothing that does define me. And keeping that mindset on the forefront of your mind, or like as long as it's more ingrained into like your baseline values, that seems to be the best way to have like a really good hold on your ego. And it's not a good hold on your ego. It's a good way to just understand your ego, and that way you get to choose whether you're going to be affected by it or not. Because there's certain egoic desires that are very good. Like for instance, the one we were just talking about, self-improvement, oftentimes that's an egoic desire. That's a good thing. Like you should constantly want to be, a little bit better than you were the day before. That's a great thing. And so, getting rid of that attachment to the idea that, I'm going to constantly try to be a little bit better. I don't want to get rid of that attachment because I think that's an important one. But, you know, my attachment to the things that make me feel insecure about the way that I look, or like my attachment about the things that I'm insecure about, sometimes the way that I feel because it feels like I shouldn't feel certain ways. Like those attachments, those, now that I'm aware of all of it, I can prune those while still keeping the ones that provide me actual benefit. And so, it's not about being egoless. It's not about being completely zen with no attachments. It's just about being aware.
Yeah, and I think the ironic part about that is that the awareness itself is kind of what the Zen and the Buddhist push you to be, is just to strictly be solely that awareness. But to place it into, a more of a applicable perspective for most people, it's just that you being aware of the attachments and how they're affecting you allows you to determine how you want to be attached to certain things. So your attachment to the way that you look can, I'm going to stick to self improvement. Your attachment to self improvement can be, changed but not pruned. I think that's an important distinction there. Is you don't have to cut off certain attachments as well. You can just change the way that you are attached to them. And
Yeah.
even if that inherent I always need to be improving, I'm never good enough perspective, if that kind of encapsulates your mind and you don't feel as if you can just kind of wash it away in the very moment, then all you can really do is be aware of it. And I'm telling you, if you are aware and curious about that attachment and you spend your time, obviously not all of your time, but when those thoughts arise about you trying to improve and about you not being enough, if you just spend, a few moments to be curious about why these thoughts are arising. Why am I so attached to this thing? The attachment will diminish itself, and you won't feel that it's, as important. You'll be just kind of curious, but the curiosity will make the attachment, um, it'll make the attachment kind of what it is. It'll simplify it down to what it is, just being that attachment, just being that internal drive to improve in this case. And understanding now that's all it is, then maybe now it doesn't happen perfectly the first time, it doesn't happen perfectly the second time, it doesn't really happen perfectly anytime, but having that curiosity, having that awareness gives you the capability, um, at least over time, it'll either diminish the importance of the attachment, to the point where you can kind of shift your perspective on it, or you will, through the curiosity, through the understanding of really what it is, just kind of be able to shift it to an extent manually. But that would be more of someone who is truly kind of, just hyper aware of themselves, of their surroundings, of how those things interact with their perspective and reality, um, and understanding that their ego, their reality isn't everything, but it's certainly something that can, in a modern world where success is so important, um, it can shift your perspective on it to understand that success in one field may be really important, but not everything. There's success in many other aspects of life that are also just as important.
So I have like one more example on the attachment thing that kind of just came to me that I like, and then I'm gonna sidetrack us a bit. But for instance, I don't drink, you know, and that's a really interesting one because it's a non-attachment almost. It's like I'm attached to this idea that I don't do something. Um, but being aware of that attachment means that you can, for instance, for me, like whenever somebody offers me a drink, it's not that I'm saying no to it because I'm, scared that if I do, that part of me will die or like any of these little random things. It's simply the fact that, I prefer not. And because I actually just prefer to not drink, I also don't feel any pressure by the attachment itself because now I've fleshed it out, kind of what you were talking about with this curiosity. I've fleshed it out to the more core value of, I'm not worried about the way that I'm going to behave on it. I'm not worried that it's not saying that these are not any concerns that I have. Like I'm not particularly worried about it for health reasons. It's none of that. It's just that I don't particularly enjoy drinking, and so I'm perfectly okay with the fact that I'm not going to drink. Um, and it's just about like because of the fact that I'm aware of that, and because of the fact that I'm not just letting it be something that's just a part of my identity. It's not that I don't drink. It's just that I don't really want to drink. Um, and I think that is a large piece of it is disconnecting a lot of the things that you do or that you like to do away from you yourself. Like it's not that, I am just someone who's always in good shape. It's I just like being in good shape. Being in good shape brings me happiness. Or, I am someone that is intelligent. No, I happen to be knowledgeable and intelligent about certain topics. And I enjoy those topics because I get to like kind of flesh out or flex my brain a little bit and like do that. But it's not something that's like inherently a part of me. It's something that's been crafted over the last 19 years. Um, and it's been crafted by a lot of things that I don't control. And so I'm also not going to attach myself to something that is, again, outside of my control. And so I think a lot of this ties back into just the idea of what you do control and what you don't. And I control my awareness to some extent. I control my my reactions to things, and I control typically the headspace that I exist in. And so if I can just maintain focus on those things, then that way I can start to kind of figure everything else around it out. So it's kind of the classic idea of like the less I try, the better things get kind of idea. And it's not that I'm forcing myself to get rid of attachments. It's that I'm actually just kind of thinking about them. And because of the process of being curious about these attachments, I now realize that certain, I not even realize, I now truly understand that there's certain attachments that are not positive. And so it's not even that I'm forcing myself to disconnect from them. Oftentimes, whenever you're truly aware of these attachments, whether they be positive or negative, it's not that you even do anything then. It's more just, okay, I have now realized that this is something that I really, it does not benefit my life. And in fact, it makes my life worse. And so now that I truly understand that because I've been curious about it, it's not even that I have to force myself to do something. I just don't want to do it anymore. I don't have the desire for it anymore. And I think that makes things a lot easier because frankly, like life is hard in certain ways, but life shouldn't be this constant struggle of, you know, letting your ego like take over and letting your attachments kind of win this battle of constantly like just controlling what you are. Because ultimately, again, not we've already talked about this, but like you just are nothing. Like you aren't anything inherent. There's nothing about you that makes you you other than the fact that you are the being that has experienced all the things that you've experienced. And so whenever you realize that, you mean that you realize that all of these experiences are all tied into you. And some of these experiences are tied into you in several different ways. And it's just about if you understand that and you can realize that, then you have way more control over, which is ultimately a lot of what people are trying to get. You now have way more control over the way that you perceive your world, which is ultimately what matters. Because, there are people, people always talk about perspective, like just get a little perspective. When you actually have a genuine understanding of who you are, why you are the way that you are, and what you can actually do about those things, your perspective is entirely defined by what you choose rather than a lot of the things that like I kind of got a little off my train of thought there, but it's more just if your perspective is we all recognize how important your perspective is, and so much of your perspective is influenced by these attachments and these assumptions and comparisons that you make that you're not even realizing that you're making. And so just being aware of those things allow you to control your perspective a lot more, which hopefully will reap you a lot of positive, like, reinforcement and also just a lot of benefit. But something I guess I would like to talk about, and I'm going to ask you about is, we've
Wait,
kind of talked about.
before you go on to another point, I'd like to just make one comment about this awareness that we're speaking of. And while it may seem very abstract at the moment and kind of out of reach and unachievable for some, something I'd like to emphasize is that this awareness is just as your muscles are. It just takes practice, it just takes time and effort. And enough time and effort will get you to a point where you can really be aware. Um, so that's something to keep in mind for those of you that think that this is out of your realm. That's just strictly the reality you're telling yourself. And I'm telling you that many, many people have thought the same thing, but attempted to be aware. And through practice and true effort, they've gotten to a point where they can be aware of what it is that their ego is telling themselves.
And that's actually a perfect thing to go into what I was about to say, which is, we've talked about attachment, we've talked about ego, we've talked about comparisons, we've talked about what these things are doing and kind of what your like goal should be around them, which is just awareness. And the awareness itself gives you more access to having control over what you at least should have control over, or what you actually do, not what you should. So I guess now the question that I feel like we can kind of end the podcast on and talk about for a while is, what are some actual practical ways you can start being aware? Because it's really hard to understand what awareness we're talking about if you've never experienced it. And even if you have experienced it, if you've slipped out of it, it's really hard to kind of start to regain your footing. And so, like, I think that maybe it would be useful if we kind of went over, even for us, just what are some of the practical ways that we usually catch ourselves either being aware or like catching ourselves having our ego take over. Like, what are the things that we kind of almost look for, in terms of what we're actually trying to be aware of?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say the two practices that one of them I've implemented very, very recently, and the other one I've been doing for on and off for a little bit now is one of them being journaling for me. So for me, writing down my experiences, especially emotional experiences, where it seems that it's very much derived from my ego and not derived from myself, I'm able to kind of look back at those moments and how I felt in those moments and recognize certain patterns that arise. And those patterns or illuminate what attachments that it is that I'm having. So recognizing these patterns through my experiences that I've had in the past allow me to indicate what it is that I am attached to. So then instead of, me having to kind of sit here in a meditative state and say, oh, I'm attached to this right now. Oh, I feel so attached to this right now or that. I can go, oh, I can tell you that in these three instances, I had very emotional responses to similar stimuli. So I know I'm really attached to those things. So that's just kind of a good way to it's kind of just like a track record or almost like a play by play where you can go back and say, okay, here's what happened. So this indicates that I am attached to this or I am attached to that. And it's just a good way to kind of illuminate what those attachments are. Now, it's not necessarily going to allow you to correct them. That's kind of what you have to do on your own, but it does illuminate them for you, so it makes it more possible to correct them. And then another practice that I've been doing very, very recently, this is just super, super recent, is a practice called Yoga Nidra, where simply the whole practice, it's very similar to traditional meditation. You'll lay down and you'll close your eyes or cover your eyes with something and you'll try to get really comfortable. And the whole practice is going through different parts of your body, whether that be the brain, the tongue, the fingers, the quads, and trying to be put all of your awareness on that one part of your body. And I've only done it very recently, so I can't tell you if it's something that's really changed a lot about how I've experienced in the long term. But in the short term, it makes me feel extraordinarily centered. It makes me feel as if the thoughts that typically arise without my doing kind of quiet themselves, and it feels that I'm just aware of my bodily sensations, aware of the individuals I'm interacting with, and aware of how I'd like to approach that interaction. Um, so I think those two for me, as of lately, have been pretty useful. So I'll push that on to you. What practices have you implemented that have done similar things?
Well, to be honest, those are probably more practical than the things that I'm going to say because they're actual like practices,
Mm-hmm,
versus mine are kind of like mindsets that I've been trying to get into, or like just headspaces I've been trying to implement more. So one of the things, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it plays in. One of the things that I think almost all of these attachments and negative things stem from is a lack of control on your actual awareness. And so being able to direct that awareness in a very efficient way, or just in a very, in a way that helps you doing whatever you're trying to do, is something that's very important. And so one of the things that I've been really trying to do recently is just get out of my default mode, get out of my more recently, I slipped more recently I slipped kind of back into a more egoic way of living. Um,
an assumption way of living.
yeah, making lots of assumptions, making lots of comparisons, having attachments that I wasn't necessarily aware of, just kind of the typical opposite of what we're talking about. And so something I've been really trying to do is control my awareness. And so it's similar to what you're doing in the sense that what I do often is, every once in a while I just kind of look up and I really try to consider what I'm experiencing. And so a lot of times that is kind of this idea of focusing, again, like you said, kind of on the body. It's like, what am I experiencing right now? What feeling am I having? Is there any particular reason for that, or is it just there? Like right now, my chest is like not necessarily tight, but like I can like feel it. It's like there, but there's no actual attachment to what is happening, and so I'm aware that there's no particular reason that my chest feels like that. It's just the way that it feels right now. Versus, sometimes I'll notice that like I'm tense or whatever it may be. And then the other thing that I think, hopefully this will actually be practical, the thing that I really try to do with my ego is watch for comparative thinking, which I know I already kind of said at the beginning of this. Anytime I'm going to make some level of comparison about this other person versus me, or even really me versus me, which I know kind of contradicts what I said earlier. I really try to catch those comparisons and redirect my awareness to something that is not that. And so if I'm comparing myself even to just previous me,
They're going crazy out there.
literally just looking at me. Um, but even the comparisons that I'm making to myself are just things that don't need to be made. I'm not the same person I was. I'm not the same person I was 5 minutes ago, let alone 6, 8, 10, 12, 2 years. Like, I was gonna say 12 months and then like 2 years, but I think you got it. Either way, I really try to watch for just any level of comparative thinking, and I think that also kind of integrates itself with assumptions, because it's just whenever you're more conscious about the way that you're thinking, you stop making as many assumptions. Because usually, what assumptions actually just are, or it's your brain saving energy. It's like it's just being more efficient. For instance, I know that you don't typically take things the wrong way when I say them more brashly. And so I'm more willing to kind of just like save the energy and be more brash because you're typically either going to not let me do it, or you're just not going to take them like you're not going to take them uh,
Personally.
entirely seriously. Yeah, exactly. And so I'll make that assumption with instead, if I'm just gonna be more conscious about that though, while I'm trying to say something to you, I'll catch the assumptions that I'm making and kind of flesh them out beforehand. And it's like, well, maybe I'm assuming, for instance, just when we're talking throughout this podcast, we've caught ourselves multiple times saying like better or any of those because like, well, first off, like that's just a broad assumption that even the people that are listening or even you or me know what that better is. When in reality, we're not trying to say better. We're trying to say something way more specific, which is like, I don't want to look better. I want to look more, I want to look more muscular and a little bit, leaner. And I want to, I don't want to be better at these types of conversations. I want to be more effective at communicating what I'm trying to say. And so a lot of it is kind of the specificity of language to me, is if you can really try to catch yourself and just do a really good job of, or at least try to do a really good job of accurately portraying exactly what you're feeling rather than kind of this like snippet of it, that really helps you be aware. And it also helps you just catch your assumptions more, just because you're saying them out loud.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's well said, and I like that we have different approaches to this. It can maybe get into the minds of the individuals who are, well, the individual. Maybe we'll get one view. We'll see. Who chooses to take part in listening to, especially if they get to this part in the video. Oh my God, if they got to this part,
They're goaded.
props,
If you
props.
made it this far into the podcast, reach out to me somehow, and I'll give you a clean high five.
Literally comment anything, and we'll send you merch that we don't have.
Yeah, you will be the first in line to get some sort of merch that we're probably never gonna make.
Yeah. Well, to summarize, pretty much what we're kind of getting out here is that the ego is this attachment formulating system within our body, within our mind, that clearly is continually making attachments and creating thoughts to protect those attachments, right? And those attachments can be good or bad, cause insecurities, cause you to give yourself the delusion that you have lots of control or that you have no control. Um, those attachments determine the story, the reality that you're telling yourself, and that reality entirely determines the amount of agency that you believe you have, and that reality entirely determines everything that you experience, because it is the reality that you're having, right? And that's entirely up to you, at least to choose to at least try to alter it, and some methods to try to change this reality to better suit what it is that you would like to experience, or to be closer to quote unquote objective reality, is the things that I brought up, which was journaling and yoga nidra or meditation in general, of just kind of being aware of your body specifically, and being aware of your mind, and watching the thoughts as they come and go, and then Will's mindfulness that he implements into his day to day. And I'll let you kind of go into detail about how to implement that.
Yeah, I mean it's very similar what you're talking about. It's just try to be more aware. And so a lot of ways to start doing that is really easy in terms of just try to be more aware of the physical sensations you're having. And then try to be more aware of the types of words that you're using and why you're using them. And that way whenever you start to do that with the specificity of language, even in fact not just even, to me that has been the single largest shift that I've noticed in the way that I think is that if I'm way more intentional about the words that I'm choosing to use, my brain is just forced to start to sift out so many of the assumptions and so many of the comparisons that I'm making, because they're actually getting in the way of what I'm trying to say. And then the last thing that I would actually add to that is just spend time actually with yourself. And so, if you're home alone, not saying all the time, but like if you're home alone and you're going to just tune out and you're going to throw on a YouTube video or you're going to watch TV or you're going to scroll through TikTok, whatever it is, maybe take a couple minutes every so often, take 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes and just actually sit with yourself and say, okay, like, how are you doing? Like what is there anything that's there that has been bothering me for a while? Is there anything there that I've been really happy about that I haven't actually given myself time to enjoy? Like, just sit with yourself. Try to understand yourself. Because I think the majority of the problems that we're talking about, or not even problems, just the majority of the things that we're talking about right now can all be either enhanced or pruned or whatever it is by simply actually spending time with yourself. You are yours. Like treat you like you were treating a child that you're trying to raise in a sense. So, make sure you like all the corny stuff, give yourself plenty of love, but also make sure that, if there's certain things that you're doing that you don't want to be doing, find a way either like figure out first why you don't want to be doing them and find a way to start kind of pruning those and changing them. It's you are raising a human being. It just so happens that the human being that you're raising is you. Like, so, treat you the way that you would want to treat your child, essentially.
And similarly, the best way that you can raise a child is by spending lots of time with them. So the more time you spend with them, the better you understand, the easier it is to inform them on X, Y, or Z. And the same thing goes for yourself. The more time you spend with yourself and truly with yourself, the better you'll understand and the more aware you can be of the patterns that occur.
I also think something which is this is a little off topic, and I think we can kind of end it after this, is that the more time you spend with yourself, the more you realize that it's one of the most fun things you can do because the depth of your personal experience is deeper and more interesting than the experience you can get from any other human being. Like I love spending time with you, but even in our best moments, it's still not quite as interesting as the depth of my own experience. Because even like in the sense that I will only ever get a piece of what you are. Even if we try to flesh things out as hard as we can and I try to understand you as much as I possibly can, I will never understand the depth of your experience to even a third of the degree that I understand my own. And so spending more and more time with yourself allows you to flesh all of that out and you end up realizing how interesting your own experience is rather than constantly being focused on what other experiences are.
Interesting, interesting. I mean, I definitely think that sharing experiences to me seems to illuminate a lot, but I understand what you're saying in regard to you can't get into the complete depth of another individual, but you can get into the complete depth of your own self, which can make that, more profound. Um, yeah, I think that's a good way to end it.
Yeah. Well, and like just to finish off what you were just saying, I think experiencing stuff with other people is fantastic, and like learning about other people's experiences are fantastic. It's just that you will never understand those experiences to the level that you can understand your own. And so getting really, really good at understanding yourself and your own experiences is a lot of fun. And the
It'll
more
also
you
make
do
you
it,
better at understanding others' experiences because you have a better understanding of your own.
yeah, having an understanding of me genuinely, and this is obviously broad, but like having a great understanding of me means that I have a very good understanding of what it is like to be a human being.
Yeah.
And if I understand that, I understand you just instantly. Like I don't understand all about your life, but I understand the existence that you that you
We can
have.
relate on the human level better.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thanks for listening,
Yeah, that one
random
viewer that's still
one
here,
guy.
you're a goat.
Dude, if he stayed after the last thing that we already thanked him for, that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Especially
I guess
considering our
on that
average
note,
watch
though,
time right now is like 4 minutes.
yeah, well, that's not bad because it's better than 3 minutes.
It is. Hey, did you just compare something?
No, that's
Oh,
time is actually a fiction, a construct that doesn't exist. So there was no comparison.
what about this little clock on our top left right here?
It's made up.
Like, what is it counting though?
Ants.
Oh, so like there's just